Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John. I'm an author, and welcome to my writing corner. And I'm here today to read to you the 16th chapter of The Shadow of the Past, entitled The Veil of Twilight. Before we get started, if you're new here, just joining, I would love for you to like the video, share, subscribe, all that stuff. It really helps me out and helps out the channel, and I really appreciate it. I would also love to hear your comments and thoughts about the chapter, my story so far, my reading style, all that good stuff. So if you would leave a comment, I would absolutely love that. All right. Well, so grab yourself a drink. Got one here myself so I don't lose my voice. And we're going to start Chapter 16, The Veil of Twilight. Although the slope on the north side was gentle, it took much longer for Gera to make the descent. Val'inar knew full well that the horse was spent and thus did not push for speed and allowed Gera to travel at his own pace down the stony slope. Val'inar felt naked descending down the face of the mountain without any form of cover, but that could not be helped. With any luck, all eyes were turned to Dakaran, thinking that that was where he was going, and where he would stay until he won the aid of the people of Camral or died in the attempt. Inare Cataer, which had stood so clearly in the distance from the dragon's peak, now seemed to shrink lower and lower, as his horse wearily snaked his way through the boulders which littered the north face of the mountain. Val'inar was not sure whether it was his own fatigue playing tricks on his eyes or else some kind of defense. It was going on dusk by the time horse and rider got far enough past the snow line to rest. Val'inar ate a little and felt sorry for Gera, who had no grass to graze upon. The elf woke early and resumed the descent down the mountain. Gera was fresher that day, but still did not have his full strength back. It was once more getting toward nightfall when they finally reached the bottom of the Dragon's Pass. It took a further half hour for Val'inar to spy the narrow defile that led down into the source of the so-called Dragon's Tail. Val'inar had to admit to himself that, seen from far away, it certainly did look like the mountain had a tail. Water poured forth from a great chasm in the side of the mountain and cascaded down some 20 yards or so, and this was the beginning of the great river Dracoiena, the tail of the dragon. After winding its way from the deep ravine, it snaked its way some 200 miles until it reached the sea, fed by many tributaries along the way. The river served as the heart of the most agriculturally rich region of Sirana, the Abayenda Valley, which played a large role in why the alliance of cities dominated by Telmar was able to sustain such vast populations. At the heart of the region stood Inare Cataer, an unimpressive hill to be seen from a distance, which stood in the dead center of the region, and was the only raised position. Few, from the highest king to the lowest peasant, had ever been known to set foot upon the large island upon which Inare Cataer rested and returned unchanged, if they returned at all. Val'inar knew that there would be no patrols this close to the mountain, so within sight of the waterfall he finally dismounted Gera, and after taking a quick repast of some nuts and hard cheese, he stretched himself out against one of the thin and bent trees which grew practically from the bank of the river and allowed himself to drift off into sleep. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion that Val'inar was grateful that, for the second night in a row, the dreams had not come to him, so he slept soundly, and it was well after sunrise when he awoke. The horse seemed much better for the long night of rest within sight of the waterfall. It did not complain when Val'inar mounted him and set off at a trot. Even though the horse looked much refreshed, Val'inar knew enough of horses that he should not try to push the horse again, at least not until some time had elapsed, or he might well lose him. It was also rougher going. The ravine was deep and narrow here. It would not take much for a horse to cripple himself on an unexpected tree root or go plunging into the river. Following the river to Inare Cataer was also longer, as the river snaked its way onwards, adding at least half again the distance to the trip than if Val'inar had followed a straight line. Despite the distance and the initial dangers of the ravine, Val'inar knew this was the safer road. Union patrols were bound to be all over the region, and entering the valley from the source of the river was about the only way that he might slip past their patrols unnoticed, as the people of Telmar only approached the river to draw water from it or cross it. There were also several cities which lay across the river's tributaries, and many villages and farms around the valley, but none had ever been built on the river itself between the mountain and Inare Cataer. Val'inar also figured that the patrols would increase as word had no doubt have reached the Union that the Romaldans were now their enemy, and they would be worried that the Romaldans would find some way of just strike at their breadbasket, especially since this had been the favored method of invasions in times past. Going was slow, just as Val'inar figured, although the progress Gera made was still good, especially as the ravine steadily widened and grew shallower. The trees became steadily taller and straighter, with fewer masses of jutting roots. It was about 2 hours after midday when they finally, quite suddenly, emerged from the ravine. A thin band of trees, perhaps a mile across, followed the river as it wound its way through the valley, but beyond that, the vast miles of farmland stretched as far as Valinar's eyes could see, through gaps in the thinly spaced trees. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes after he had left the ravine behind that Valinar's ears perked up at the sound of a score or more hoofbeats. There was a small wooden bridge about a quarter-mile ahead, and a patrol of Union cavalry approached it. Val'inar reined Gera to a halt, and once the horse was still, he concentrated on keeping them hidden. Illusions were tricky. You had to maintain constant focus to sustain them, and the larger and more complex the illusion, the more focus it required. However, standing still as they were, and still a quarter of a mile so distant from the soldiers, it was not overly taxing for Val'inar to ensure that if any eyes peered upriver for signs of enemies, that they would see nothing but the forest. It took almost as much of Valinar's concentration to ensure that the horse did not start moving, as movement was the only thing, aside from one of the soldiers physically running into him, which could destroy the illusion he was creating. In case the riders decided to stop near the river or double back for something, Val'inar maintained the illusion for several minutes after his ears ceased to hear the hoofbeats of the patrol before continuing. This happened twice more before the end of the day, the second time being a near miss in which Val'inar very nearly rode right into a smaller patrol, which was rottering next to a small stretch of rapids, which prevented Val'inar from hearing them. He was even a little impressed with himself at the speed with which he put up his illusion, although he thought that one of the soldiers had seen something and was coming to investigate when the commander of the group barked an order which Val'inar could not quite hear, and the soldier departed with his comrades. The horse's fatigue forced Val'inar to stop a few hours after nightfall, although Val'inar did not sleep. Twice during the night he thought he had heard the approach of horses, but the first had just been Gera disturbing a small pile of stones by the river, and the second had been a great stag, which seemed to regard Val'inar for a long moment with black eyes, brilliantly reflecting the starlight shining through the gaps between the trees. Val'inar watered Gera shortly after dawn the following day and took a long drink of the cold and clean water himself before setting off again. Val'inar guessed that they had made at least a sixth of the journey the previous day, although it was impossible to tell for certain without clear knowledge of the area or the ability to see how distant Inare Cataer was from them. There was only one patrol that day, although he passed several fishermen's cottages and even a water wheel for the grinding of grain, but Val'inar lucked out that none of them were occupied at the time of their passing. The next day was much the same. Val'inar followed the river as it snaked its way through the woods. At points, the woods were so thin that he could easily see farmland or villages on either side. At other points, the woods were so thick that it was nothing but trees on either side. The going was fairly good, but there was no clear path through the woods, and there was not a day that went by that he did not have to avoid at least one patrol. Val'inar took his ease on the night after the fifth day, with the firm knowledge that they would, unless something unexpected befell them, reach what was known in the trade languages as the Veil of Twilight the following day. He once more did not feel the call of sleep that night. He simply sat and enjoyed the nocturnal peacefulness of the forest. The only strange event was that the stag once more returned to watch him. Val'inar was a little troubled by this, as he guessed that it was acting just like the beasts that live in Toranu, and simply seeing that they were leaving his territory. Once more, Val'inar set out shortly before dawn, and by noon he had still seen no patrols or any other sign of human habitation, which told him one thing: he was getting close. It was an hour after noon that Val'inar began to notice something bizarre. It was the height of summer, and as such, many long hours of daylight should have come after midday, but now Val'inar saw that it was getting dark. The sun was still at the same position of the sky, but it seemed dimmed and dull, and to Valinar's eyes the world seemed to be that of about an hour ere dusk. There was also something odd about the sounds, namely the absence of any but his and Gera. The woods were silent, completely silent, hard as he strained his ears. Val'inar could not hear so much as a cheep from a bird nor the scratch of a squirrel. As Val'inar started to pay more careful attention to his surroundings, he noticed also that the trees here were ancient and tall, far older than the trees in the forest which he had been riding for the previous 5 days. A woodsman's axe had not been felt in these parts for many hundreds of years at least. While he was noticing this, the tree line broke all of a sudden, and Val'inar found himself at the forking of a river. Two branches curved left and right into yet more forest, yet across from him was another wood. He had made it to the Veil of Twilight. It took Val'inar several moments to find a ford capable of taking him across the Dracoanai, which had become quite swift and strong. As soon as Gera stepped one hoof upon the far shore, it seemed like some force dimmed the sun entirely, and there now existed nothing but a world of starlight. Val'inar looked for the sun and saw through a gap in the trees that it was in the same spot, but it was nothing more than a pale yellow disk whose light could not compete with the stars. The stars themselves were another wonder. There were thousands that could clearly be seen, and even ones he recognized seemed both brighter and closer than they did on the outside world. He also experienced a rush as when he was a child reaching out into the air for the first time. All the threads seemed stronger and more vibrant, and rather than the steady chord that seemed to govern the area elsewhere, here each element was turned and mixed up with one another, rising and falling and rolling like some majestic symphony. This place was filled with great power, and it was vibrant and alive. Almost before he was aware of it, Val'inar found himself riding through a high arch several times his own height, which was made of a pale stone, intricately carved with what looked like images of stars and constellations. As he rode through the archway, he found himself on a path lit with floating globes of every color one could imagine. Various other archways and buildings branched off from this path, which seemed to lead into the heart of the island. Val'inar also became aware of a soft singing that seemed to be coming from all around. The strangest feature of all was the statues. Life-size statues lined all the pathways he could see and guarded all the buildings. The plinths on which they stood seemed to be made of simple stone as far as he could tell, but the statues themselves were carved in vividly lifelike detail, and of a dark and almost shimmering gray stone that he could not recognize. The oddest thing of all about the statues, however, was the fact that all the statues were of dwarves. Each statue was unique, and a variety of weapons were clutched in their hands. The gray-eyed statues seemed to watch him, and the whole effect made Val'inar uneasy in ways that he could not quite describe. As Val'inar was gazing upon the statues, a group of robed figures approached him from one of the side paths. They were about a dozen in all, and they stopped to study Val'inar. After a brief moment, one of them stepped forward and lowered his silver-colored hood. He was unmistakably an elf, although the likes of which Val'inar had never seen before. The elf was tall, with what Val'inar considered to be an unusually long neck. His skin was a brown color and had an almost glassy appearance to it, and the same went for his silvery hair. He stared at Val'inar with enormous, unblinking eyes that were also silver in color and seemed to reflect a myriad of far-off lights, although what exactly was being reflected he could not say for sure. After studying each other for a moment, the elf smiled and addressed him. "Welcome to you, who are Val'inar of the Elves of Balance, the last of that kin to walk upon this terra. You have travelled far, but for tonight at least you shall take your ease among us here in our humble village of Inare Cataer. We are even now heading to our evening meal, which we would be more than happy to share with you. Val'inar bowed deeply. I thank you for your hospitality. Is there some place where I may see that my horse is tended? You may release him to graze among the trees. There is naught that will harm him in these woods, and the power of the Inara Elfen shall see that he does not stray from these woods. Validar did as he was bidden, and when it was done, turned back to the group of elves, and they all began to walk down the main path towards a great building in the distance. May I ask a few questions while we walk? To start with, I am curious how you know my name, and I would like to know yours. It will take us some little time to reach the place of dining, and your queries would best be answered by the priestess. But if there is anything that I may do to put your mind at ease, I will do so. To begin with, we have watched your progress from afar, unless you are known to we who are your distant kin. I am called Yerain, and it is my charge to watch our border for incursions, which is why we met you so quickly after your entrance. Val'inar nodded at this and asked after a moment, Tell me then, Yerain, how are you able to see me from afar? Yerain smiled warmly and said, indicating his companions, That is a gift we are all possessed of. We are the elves of the stars, and our eyes are trained to see what is far off. And that skill allows us to focus our gaze anywhere on Sirana that we wish. And although focusing on one person is difficult, you have made yourself well known of late, and those that have great connection to the area are much easier to focus our sight upon. Have the elves of the stars lived here for long? Inquired Val'inar. The core of our people has been here since the imprisonment, replied Iraine. But there have been elves such as myself who have come here following the call of the stars in that time as well. So you were not born here? Where are you from, if you don't mind my asking? Iraine smiled a wan smile and responded, I was born in Astrael, where I lived for many centuries. But after the passing of my beloved and our children, I came here to seek solace. How long ago was that? 1,200 years or so, Iraine shrugged. That must make you at least 2,000 years old, exclaimed Val'inar, and unable to help his curiosity. How is it that you have not yet faded? If was offended by so personal a question, he did not show it. I have lost track of the exact count, but I am certain I have passed my 2100th year, and I can feel my fading approaching. It will happen perhaps a few decades hence, and believe me, I welcome it. But the knowledge that I would bear witness to the coming of the last scion of Torinar has kept me going. Val'inar nodded at this and took it in for some little while before he realized what his companion had said. How did you have knowledge of what is to come? Do you have the gift of seeing what may be, as I do? Iraine chuckled. I do not, but my beloved, her mother, and our daughter all had the gift. The dreams tormented them, as I know they do you, although theirs came less frequently than yours. They were not always right, but all three were insistent that I would live to see your coming here, and it was for that reason that I came to the Vale after their passing. I am sorry, Val'inar began, but Iraine cut him off gently. I have had a great many years to come to terms with their death. I thank you for your kindness, but condolences are useless now. Val'inar nodded and then slipped into silence for a moment before asking, You mentioned that you came from Astrael some 1,200 years ago. That must have been about the time the city was conquered by Cameral and your empire ended. Iraine seemed to smile sadly. Yes, I was born when we were forging our empire. I fought in the war, saw our empire expand across the plains, and watched our arrogance and vanity bring about our eventual ruin. You seem to know something of our history. Val'inar acknowledged, "It was my father's father who was Ha'atha when your people forced the aid of Turanu, when the resurgent Cameron and the Tri were starting to turn the tide against you. We made many mistakes in those days." "Without doubt," observed Val'inar. "From what my father told me, there was great slaughter of our people, and we only just prevented Cameron from burning our capital." Iraine's response was quiet and tinged with sadness. "I begged King Leiron to send aid, but he refused. And I suppose by that point we had little enough aid to send." "You knew Leiron?" Iraine nodded. "I did. I was not of his court, but even as he descended into madness, he still listened to me as one of his generals." Valinar's eyes narrowed and he searched his memory. "You are not the Iraine Lake here, are you?" The dark-skinned elf chuckled. "It has been many long years since any called me Bright Blade." Valinar was impressed. "I am honored. Your campaigns are famous even among my people. But I had thought you had died defending Astriel." Iraine shook his head. "I was prepared to, and when I saw the goblin war machines coming to aid the people of Cameral in their long siege, I thought I would. But my wife insisted that I disguise myself and escape. Said that I still had a part to play. So I disguised myself and escaped the slaughter and the fire. My wife and daughter were not so lucky." By the time Iraine was finished speaking, Val'inar and those he walked with had reached the great hall of the Inare Elfen, the Elves of the Stars. It was a great structure forming a tall dome that looked as if it had been carved from one giant block of stone by a true master. It was wide open, with great entranceways going several directions, and vaulted windows many times his own height, with nothing in them. The gleaming white stone of the building itself seemed to radiate light. The building had only one great room, with numerous tables arranged in a circle around it. Several more of the dwarf statues were placed throughout the hall, and strangely there was a great pillar of black stone in the center of the room. Several dozen elves were scattered throughout the room. All of them had silvery hair and eyes. The skin tone ranged from the darkest of browns to the snowiest white, but all had the same almost glassy texture to them, and all wore the same loose-fitting gray robes, and a few carried silver staffs with great glowing white crystals at the end. At the far end of the room was a great table, behind which was a great seat of gray stone, upon which sat the most beautiful woman that Val'inar had ever seen. Her skin was snowy white, and it seemed, to Val'inar at least, not quite so glassy as her companions. She wore a loose-fitting and almost translucent white dress clasped at her waist with a chain of silver moons. Her face seemed hard and stern, but when she saw him she smiled, and that smile was like the rising of the moon. Val'inar could also sense that she was extremely powerful, more so perhaps than any he had yet met save Ushara and the elementals. Iraine headed over to introduce him. "I am Val'inar, son of Yanira," he managed, bowing his head low, "and I thank you and your people for your hospitality." "Welcome, Val'inar," she replied. "We have been waiting for you for a long time, and we have watched you grow and prosper from your earliest days in the Turanu forest to your swift journey over the Dragon's Pass. I am Alira, the priestess of the moon and leader of these, the Starlight Elves." Val'inar was quite taken aback by this pronouncement, and it took him a moment to collect his thoughts. "How is it that I have been known to you for so long?" Alira smiled and beckoned him to take a seat beside her. When that was done, she clapped her hands and a variety of breads and salads were brought out. And once everyone, including Val'inar, had begun to eat, she addressed him. "Your entire family was known to us, Val'inar. We have been watching the exiled Seira Elfen since the day that your forefather sent them forth from Inare Cataer, as Torinar bade us. Most of the ones you see here are descendants of the highborn that were left here to guard the old city. We are no longer of the strength which you yourself possess, but we have protected this hill from intrusion for millennium, with some help." Val'inar smiled. I guess the rumors are not true. I was told that you did not anyone anywhere near Inare Cataer. We don't, Alira replied simply. Any who come here seeking Inare Cataer are destroyed once they have been tested. But any of the elf kind who feel the calling of the stars are welcome here, as long as they are willing to swear the oath of eternal allegiance. Tested? Inquired Val'inar. Am I to be put to the test? Oh, yes, replied Elira with a smile. Great power rests within an Cataer, and it is our great oath that none may ascend the hill unless their strength, determination, and heart have been tested. And if I fail the test? Inquired Val'inar. Oblivion. What is to stop me from just ascending the hill? None has ever gotten past the Guardians, said Elira, her smile widening to a grin. But even if someone managed to do so, Inare Cataer is protected by an ancient barrier. Even one such as yourself could spend a century and not be able to find your way through. Passing the test is the only way to gain the keystone to get through. Why must I be tested? If you have been watching me, have I not proven my abilities? And surely you are aware of the danger which threatens us all. You have proven that you have some skill, nothing more, replied Elira sharply. And while I grant there is a danger, you have yet to offer proof that you would not yourself turn into a threat to us all, given access to the power dwelling within Inare Cataer. Val'inar fumed with impatience at this, and it was a few minutes before he resumed speaking. During the entire time he was aware of Elira studying him intently as if to see he could possibly do next. At last, after Val'inar had eaten some of the fruit which had been placed before him, as well as a very fine fish, and had taken a long drink of the cold, crisp water which was served him, did he address his hosts again. The workmanship on these statues is amazing. May I ask why they are dwarves, however? Elira smiled at this. They are not of dwarves, Val'inar. They are dwarves. Val'inar was distinctly puzzled. Yes, I can see that. Who carved them? Elira, Iraine, and several other elves within earshot chuckled at this to the annoyance of Val'inar. They were not carved. They are dwarves. They are the Guardians of Inare Cataer. At last, comprehension dawned on Val'inar. How is that possible? And if they are statues, how are they able to guard anything? The dwarves call it, as near as I can be rendered in our language, the final sacrifice. It is the greatest and deepest of all dwarven magics. Do you know what happens to dwarves when they die? Yes, much as humans and goblins molder or elves fade into the elements, dwarves petrify into stone, a process which takes several years, I believe. Correct. However, a dwarf may voluntarily turn himself into stone instantly in the final sacrifice, and they make a promise within the weaving of that spell, which allows another to animate the stone for the purpose of fulfilling that promise. Ah, said Val'inar, remembering something he had been told by the Lady of Fire. A dwarven city was directly beneath Inare Cataer. Very good, said Elira. King Hrather, the great-grandson of King Vroon, who was the fast friend of Tornal, saw that most of his people were leaving his city to settle in the mountains in the south, and that in a few generations there would not be enough dwarves to guard Inare Cataer as they had promised. Seeing this, he sent all but those members of his personal guard who had volunteered away to the south, and, sealing the entrance to his city, he and his guard, altogether nearly 1,000 dwarves, performed the final sacrifice, and pledged to protect Inare Cataer until a scion of Toronar should return and claim his birthright, or this terra is unmade. And he gave the elves living here the secret to calling upon them in need. Yes, we need only speak the right words to the statues, and the stone itself shall become animated and drive off whatever assails this place. How powerful are they? Elira smiled. You have heard the stories, I trust. They have destroyed whole armies. What stone is it they are made of? I do not recognize it. I do not know the dwarven name for it, I am sorry to say, admitted Alira. But we call it Ferron. It is the hardest stone we know to exist, and is all but impervious to magical attack. That is quite a testament to our author's power. From what I have gathered from our ancient scrolls, normally when the final sacrifice is performed, the dwarf is transformed into ordinary stone. I do not know near enough about dwarven magic to say how they were able to achieve a transformation into so much harder a stone, but it has served us well over the years. So, which one of these is the king? Is he in this hall? Alira indicated for Val'inar to look behind her chair, and standing there about a dozen yards behind her was the largest dwarf Val'inar had ever seen, nearly approaching human height. He had a great braided beard which hung down below his waist. Even solid gray, his eyes were fierce, and he held a great axe clasped in his hands. After studying the statue for several minutes, Val'inar realized that it stood at the entrance of another path which clearly led up the hill towards Inare Cataer. Do not try it, Alira warned. Make no mistake, I will say the words if you attempt to make a break for the hill, and these statues come to life instantly and are faster than you would think possible. Or perhaps we would just leave you to starve at the top of the hill, or as I said, even your power and skill could not get through the barrier erected by your forefather. Val'inar smiled at this. I see I have underestimated your skill. Never before has anyone been able to pluck a thought from my head as I was thinking it. You were not expecting it, replied Alira simply. I have no doubt that I could not have done so if you had been defending yourself. Now come, the feast is done, and we should leave the hall for them to prepare for your trial on the morrow. With that, Alira rose and beckoned for Val'inar to follow her. She led him to a building that was directly adjacent to the great hall. To call it a building was perhaps an overstatement. It was simply more like a space that was surrounded by many pillars, with a great silvery tree growing from its center, that it had a clear spring bubbling up into a small pool at its base, before running down a small stone channel out from the building. Welcome to the Temple of the Moon, where I and my foremothers before me have come to contemplate the moon and stars and ways of the world. It is beautiful, said Val'inar, and quite peaceful, although I still do not understand why I must go through a trial. I have already explained that, replied Alira patiently, and I confess that I hope that you succeed. I know the danger that faces us all, and you are probably the best and only hope for Sirana, but we cannot abandon the oath we swore. Val'inar nodded in reluctant agreement to this, but turned away and looked up at the brilliant stars above him. Alira stared at him for a few moments as if making up her mind, before quickly disrobing and sliding silently into the pool of water. I must confess, she said after she had done so, that I had never thought to see you here. We have watched you and your kin for so long from afar, wandering, hidden. We have felt for you, and here at last you are standing before me, real as life and in all the power and glory of what you once were. Val'inar responded, not turning. I am sorry that you have lost so much. Perhaps that is something you could regain in time. Alira chuckled. We do not wish to regain it. Everything passes in time, and we have made our choices for good or ills, and this is where we are. There is no use dwelling on the past and what was. Our power is still great in the eyes of all those who walk this terra, and we are content. That is very wise, said Val'inar, coming to sit by the edge of the pool. Alira smiled at this. Come join me, the water is cool and most refreshing. You are no doubt tired and dusty from your travels. Val'inar did as he was bid, taking off his travel-worn garments and the armor which lay beneath them before sliding into the pool of water. The cool water felt good on his aching muscles, and he had not realized how dirty he had become on the road. He rinsed himself off, and then leaned back against the side of the pool. Alira was studying him impassively from the other side, and as if making up her mind again, she turned to a pitcher that was just to the side of the water and poured 2 cups of a dark liquid into it. She handed one cup wordlessly to Val'inar and took a long drink from the other. Val'inar smelled the fruity musk of the beverage, a potent wine he guessed, and took a drink himself. The liquid burned his mouth with its potency and warmed him as it went down. It tasted of dark fruits and warm spices and was oddly refreshing even with its strength. He smiled and took another drink. He leaned once more on the wall of the pool, this time more heavily, and regarded Alira. There was something about her, and he had so many more questions. He took another drink from the cup. His arm was now heavy, and he realized that he had been trying to address his companion, but could not get the words to come. He felt a warm and dizzying sleep come upon him, far beyond the measure of even the strongest of wines. Realizing too late what had happened, he tried to conjure his power to expel the poison, but his mind was too foggy, and he felt himself slowly slipping down the pool. Moving with surprising speed, Alira crossed the pool and caught him before his head hit the water. His vision was blurred and all his muscles were limp, and as such he did not resist as Alira in one motion lifted him from the pool and laid him on the edge of the water. He tried to roll away, but it was no use. The last thing he remembered before blacking out was seeing Alira lift his head up and look into his eyes, her face full of remorse, and say something to him. He could not hear what she said, but it looked like she had said, "I'm sorry." Val'inar awoke with a start on the great hall. He looked around and saw that all the tables had been cleared away, but a half ring of stone chairs lined the far end of the hall with their backs to the living statue of King Hrothgar. He noticed that he was clothed in his tunic and trousers and was bound to the gleaming black pillar that he had noticed at the center of the room. More troubling, he could not feel the air save as a faint and distant humming, which with all his efforts he could not reach. After what seemed like an hour, a dozen elves filed into the room and set themselves upon the stone chairs, among them Moraine and Alira. Alira, rather than take her seat, approached Val'inar. "Val'inar, son of Ynira, you are here brought to the trial of Starlight, in which your worthiness to wield the powers resting in Inare Cataer shall be judged by those you see before you." Val'inar burst out in anger when she was done speaking. "You! I thought you cared about what I was trying to do." Alira smiled sadly. "I do care, Val'inar, more deeply than perhaps you shall ever know. I was serious when I said that I hope you succeed, but I was equally serious when I said I would not abandon my oath." "Why drug me then?" Val'inar spat back, his anger unabated. "I would have come to the trial willingly." "Would you have?" mused Alira. "You forget that if we have watched your progress, and we know of your disregard for rules and laws for the sake of your mission. This is not in itself a bad characteristic, but you might well have slipped off in the middle of the night, and we could not have that." "There must have been a better way," countered Val'inar, "rather than drugging me." "I am sorry for that," sighed Alira. "I truly am, but it was the best way. You could not have overcome all of us, but you are far greater than any of us alone, and if we had been forced to restrain you, there would have been injuries. What about your guardians? We could have called them up, that is true, but that would have risked your death, and regardless of what you may think of me right now, I do not wish to see that. I wish to see you succeed, and for that you must face the trials unharmed, and of course alive." Val'inar sighed in resignation. "Perhaps you're right, but I still do not like being tricked." "I do not blame you," replied Alira as she turned away from Val'inar and proceeded towards her seat. "I would feel the same in your position." Val'inar took a deep breath as if to steel himself up. "All right, let's get this trial started then. I am ready." And that brings us to the end of the chapter. I really hope you enjoyed both the content and my dramatic reading. My dog Rory certainly did. So I'd love for you to leave your comments on what you thought. I'll take anything, praise, criticism, feedback, whatever you got, I'd be happy to hear. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff to help me and the channel out. But in the meantime, for the moment, I do hope you have a wonderful rest of your whatever day you're on, that you get a chance to do and experience something creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.